Chapter 1. Rescue from Drowning. I had been in the water for about an hour. I was cold, exhausted, and had a terrible pain in my right leg. I thought I was going to die. Struggling without hope and without success, I could see the line of lights along the water's edge. I gave up trying to cross the current and thought instead about my wasted career, now that my life was coming to an end. It had been my luck to be into a family of good English background. I was born of parents whose knowledge of money was far greater than their knowledge of nature and raising children. Even though every material need and wish was met, there was no love for me or any sign of a happy family life. My father was an educated man and known as an authority of old goods. He gave no thought to his family. He was always involved in the ideas and practice of his business. My mother, known far more for her good looks than her good sense, satisfied herself with the admiration of the society in which she spent most of her time. I went through the regular school and college routine of a boy from a conventional English family. As I grew older and found an interest in girls, my parents suddenly became aware that I was a young man with normal feelings and tried to discipline my behavior. It was too late. I made the most terrible and public mistake, and my parents would have nothing more to do with me. I was also ignored by the society I had disgusted for so long. My father gave me money and said that he never wanted to see or hear from me again. With this money, I paid for a passage on a ship to Australia. Since then, my life had been one long journey from one corner of the earth to the other. Now I found myself a strong, healthy sailor of 30 years of age, drowning in the San Francisco Bay because of a very successful attempt to desert my ship. My right leg was stiff with cold, and I was suffering extreme pain throughout my body. A slight wind stirred up the rough sea, which washed into my mouth and down my throat. I could do nothing to stop swallowing most of the water. Although I still managed to float, I was quickly becoming unconscious. I have a faint memory of floating past the wall at the side of the bay and catching sight of a light on a boat sailing up the river. After that, I remembered nothing more. I heard the low noise of insect life and felt the gentle air of a spring morning blowing on my cheek. Gradually it blew with a regular flow, to which my body seemed to respond with a soft movement. I floated on the gentle summer's sea, rising and falling with faint pleasure of each comfortable wave. Suddenly the movement grew stronger, and the noise of the insects grew louder. The waves became higher and higher, and I was thrown about on a stormy sea. A huge pain struck me, and I was conscious of brilliant flashes of light and the sound of rushing water in my ears. A strange and sudden feeling caused me to wake. The scene, of which I was the main character, was an unusual one. I could see that I lay in a very uncomfortable position on the floor of a boat. On either side, grabbing my arms and working them up and down like pump handles, were two men with dark skin. An apparatus had been tied around my head, which connected my lungs to the machine I will describe in a moment. My nose, however, had been closed, forcing me to breathe through my mouth. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see two tubes. They were similar to small pipes, but made of a different material. The tubes came from my mouth and went off to either side of my body. The first came to a stop and lay on the floor beside me. The second crossed the floor in a number of turns and was connected to the apparatus I am about to describe. I was familiar with the general equipment of the laboratory, so I understood the machine now attached to me. It was made of glass and was the sort of apparatus used to do experiments. A container of water was surrounded by an air chamber to which was attached a vertical tube holding a glass bowl on the top. In the center of the bowl was a measuring instrument. The water in the tube moved up and down, causing air to come in and out and to reach me through the tube in my mouth. With this apparatus and the help of the men who pumped my arms so hard, breathing had been continued to be supplied with air until my natural breathing could start again. Chapter 2. Surprise Meeting. I opened my eyes as the apparatus around my head, nose, and mouth was removed. I drank a large glass of alcohol and struggled to my feet to thank whoever had saved my life. To my surprise, it was my father who stood next to me. Many years of meeting danger had taught me to control myself, and I waited to see if my father would remember me. He did not. I just seemed to be an ordinary sailor who had deserted his ship, and that is exactly how I was treated. Leaving me to the care of the natives, my father read the notes he had made on my artificial breathing. They had served me a grand meal, and I could hear a lot of chaos and confusion on deck. I could hear ropes being moved about on the boards outside. The sailors were singing as they did their work. From the noise and activity, I realized we were getting ready to sail away. What a joke this was going to be. I was going on a trip with my serve father into the wide, blue Pacific Ocean. Little did I realize as I laughed to myself who would be the center of the joke. If only I had known, I would have jumped over the side of the ship and even welcomed the awful boat I had just deserted. My life on the awful boat would have been much better compared to what I was about to face. I was not allowed outside my room until we had passed certain landmarks and the last pilot boat had returned to the bay. I appreciated this consideration from my father and thanked him in the most appropriate way I knew of a sailor. I had no idea that he had his own plans in keeping my presence secret to everyone but his sailors. He told me briefly of my rescue by his men. He assured me that there was no debt on my side, as having found me was his good luck. I still did not understand fully what he was going to do with me. He had made the apparatus to prove a theory about how the body reacts in certain conditions and had been waiting for an opportunity to try it out. He said finding me was his good luck. "You have proved it beyond all doubt," he said, then added with a protest, "but only in the small matter of drowning." He then offered me an advance of £2 on my previous wages to sail with him. I considered this generous, as he really didn't need my help on board his ship. I had expected to sit with his men for meals, so I was surprised to find myself eating at the captain's table. He noticed that I was not a common sailor, and I wanted to take this opportunity to get on his good side. I decided to take this chance to win back my father's approval. I made up a story about my education and why I had been in the water. It was not long before he noticed my interest in science, so I became his assistant, with another increase in wages. Before long, he told me more and more about his theories, and I became as enthusiastic as he was himself. The days passed quickly as I was very interested in my new studies. When I was not in my father's library, I listened to his plans or helped him in his laboratory work. There were many interesting experiments we could not do because of the rolling motion of the ship. He promised me, however, many enjoyable hours in the wonderful laboratory on the island to which we were going. He had realized the island was not marked on any of the maps and had it converted to a scientific laboratory. We had not been on the island long before I discovered I was in a terrible situation. I will describe the strange things which happened later, but first I must briefly describe the causes of the most alarming experiences that could happen to anyone. Late in life, my father had lost interest in old goods and had become much more interested in science. He had studied all the basic rules of biology as a young man, and now wanted to explore areas of science examined before. My father understood both the physical and mental functions of the body. His ideas led him to a much wider range of study, which was, at the time, quite unknown. He began studies in the chemistry relating to carbon and other sciences. He studied the nature and cause of diseases and was interested in the study of poisons. He also examined many other subjects that were related to his ideas. He started from the suggestion that the direct cause of temporary and permanent death was due to the clotting of certain elements and mixtures in the living contents of a cell. He had discovered and tested these ideas many times through several complex experiments. He found that the temporary arrest of a living creature produced unconsciousness, and a permanent arrest caused death. He stated that by artificial means, the clotting of the cell elements could be slowed down, prevented, or even reversed at a late stage. He argued that death, when it was not violent, and if none of the organs suffered injury, was merely life stopped for a short time. In such cases, life could be started again by the use of suitable methods. His idea was to discover a method through practical experimentation and prove that he could start life again in a person who appeared to be dead. Of course, he realized that life must start again before the person's body had started to decay. For his experiments, therefore, he had to use people who had just died minutes before. In an informal way with me, he had proven this theory with his breathing apparatus. I was really dead when his crew rescued me out of the water in the San Francisco Bay. Chapter 3. Constant Dying. With the experiment in mind, my father had sailed away for a year, keeping only the 2 native men to help him with the boat. Now I will explain his evil idea concerning me. He first showed me how completely I was in his power. He described his theories in detail to me, and how he would like to gain further proof that his ideas were correct. Then he made the terrible statement that I was to be the subject for his experiment. I had come face to face with death and danger in many desperate situations, but never one as serious as this. I am certainly not a coward, but this suggestion of dying many times and being brought back to life filled me with horror. I asked for time, which he granted, but he kept telling me that I would have to do as he wished. Escape from the island was impossible, and I did not want to kill myself. I thought later that dying might have been easier than having to go through the experiments. My only hope was to destroy my guards. This idea was not possible because of the measures taken by my father. I was watched day and night by 2 native men. He would not listen to my arguments. I told him I was his son. That was my last chance to persuade him, but he was like a cold machine, not a warm and real father. I cannot imagine why he married my mother or had me, for there was not the smallest amount of emotion in his cruel nature. Something that could be proved, like science, was all he understood. He had no love or pity. He only considered these human weaknesses that must be overcome. He said to me that in the beginning he had given me life, and now he had every right to take it away. He said, however, that was not his plan. He merely wished to borrow my life occasionally, promising to return it exactly at the arranged time. Of course, mistakes could happen, but the lives of men were full of such chances, and I would have to take mine. For the experiment to succeed, he wanted me in the best possible health. I was put on a diet and treated like a man before a major contest in sport. What could I do? If I had to do the experiments, I might as well be in the best possible condition. During my rest times, my father allowed me to help in setting up the apparatus and assist with some small experiments. You can imagine the interest I took in this work. At least, I sometimes had the pleasure of seeing some of my suggestions or changes put to use. After such experiments, I would smile to myself, thinking how I was actually arranging my own funeral. He began his experiments with a series of tests using poisons. When the apparatus was ready, I was killed with a strong dose of a poison used to depress the nervous system. I was allowed to lie dead for 20 hours. During that period, my body was absolutely dead as all breathing and circulation stopped. The awful part of it was that while the clotting of the blood cells proceeded, I remained conscious. I was able to experience all the horrible details. The apparatus used to bring me back to life was a tight chamber made to fit my body. It worked in a simple way. There were several small structures that controlled the flow of water, a turning metal bar with a handle and an electric motor. The air inside the apparatus was damp and pure, and filled my lungs without having to be connected to the tubes as in the previous system. Though my body was not moving, and for all I knew in the first stages of decay, I was aware of everything that happened. I knew when they placed me in the chamber. Even though my senses were dull, I was aware of substances being put into my blood to act upon the clotting process. Then the chamber was closed and the machinery started. I had never felt such fear. However, the circulation gradually returned and the body organs began to function again. An hour later, I was eating a large dinner. I did not enjoy this series of experiments or the experiments that followed. After 2 failed attempts to escape, I decided it would be better to take an interest in what was happening. Anyway, I was becoming used to it all. My father was delighted with his success, and as the months passed, his theories became more extreme than ever. We tried the main classes of poisons, the nerve poisons, the nerve gases, and the poisons that excite the nervous system. We completely avoided the poisons that break down the body organs. I became quite used to dying, and there was only one incident that shook my confidence. My father made a number of small cuts in my arm and introduced a tiny amount of the very dangerous nerve poison that is normally used to coat poison arrows. I became unconscious immediately, and my breathing and circulation stopped quickly after this. The clotting seemed to be advanced, and my father gave up hope of saving my life. At the last moment, he tried a new method of bringing me back to life. This was so successful that he was encouraged to keep repairing the experiments. He placed a manager in a glass jar from which the air had been removed. When rays of light from different directions were shone on the magnet and then stopped, no light remained in the jar. No atoms were released from the magnet. All that remained were very dull rays, which were able to go deeper into the body than any of the other known rays. Using this equipment, he photographed my body. On the negative, he found shadows of chemical and electric movements. This was proof that I had not really died. Except for the nerve poison, none of the other poisons had left any side effects. Chapter 4. Atomic Brilliance. Another series of awful experiments concerned electricity. By passing that high currents were absolutely harmless. As this did not affect me, the current was reduced and I quickly suffered a major electric shock. My father allowed me to remain unconscious for 3 days. It took 4 hours to bring me back. Once he introduced an infection that caused fits, but the pain of dying was so great that I refused to take part in any similar experiments. The easiest deaths were by cutting off my air supply, and deaths by drugs that made me fall into a deep sleep were really quite enjoyable. One time, after stopping my air supply, he kept me in a cold room for 3 months. He did not allow me to freeze or decay. This was without my knowledge, and I was shocked later to find how long I had been unconscious. I became afraid of what he might do with me as I lay dead. My fear was increased by the interest he was developing in cutting me open. The last time I was brought back to life, I discovered that he had been making cuts in my chest. Although he had sewed the cuts together, the pain was so severe that I had to stay in bed for a week. It was during this period that I made my plan for escape. While pretending to be interested in the work, I asked for and received a break from the constant dying. During this break in the experiments, I did some laboratory work for myself. My father was too interested in cutting up the animals caught by the natives to notice what I was doing. It was on two theories that I worked out my plan. I knew, of course, that water is made up of two parts. My first theory was that these parts can be changed into gas by the use of electricity. My second theory was something I had read about. There is a force that is opposite to the force that pulls objects toward the center of the Earth or Moon. A famous scientist had proved that this second force actually sends the objects away from the center of the Earth. Attraction to the Earth, for instance, only pulls the objects together, but it does not combine them. However, atomic or molecular attraction not only pulls the objects together, but combines them. I wanted to find the opposite force to this atomic or molecular attraction, a force that instead of combining objects, splits them apart. Not only did I want to discover and use this force, but I wanted to be able to use it whenever I chose. Water is formed when the molecules of the two elements contained in it act on each other and then separate and create new molecules. When electricity is applied to the molecules, it causes the molecules to split up and return to their original separate elements. The force I wanted to find must not only do this with the two elements of water, but with all elements, no matter in what forms they exist. If I could then invite my father within its range, he would explode into a mass of separate elements and be sent flying across the room. Eventually, I was able to control this force. I found it did not destroy the substance it was working on, but only the form of the substance. I also discovered that it had no effect on structures containing carbon. It was total destruction. This puzzled me at first, but after I thought about it a bit more, I realized why it was happening. There are many more atoms in the molecules containing carbon than the number of atoms in the molecules without it. This means that the molecules containing carbon are not stable. They are more likely to split and explode when they are attacked by physical forces or chemical substances. By using two powerful batteries connected with special magnets built for this purpose, two enormous forces were fired out. On their own, they were quite safe, but together they achieved their purpose by joining at a point in the air after they were fired. After testing the batteries and magnets and almost blowing myself into tiny pieces, I lay my trap. I hid the magnets so that their force made the whole area of my bedroom door a field of death. I placed a switch beside my bed where I could turn on the electric current from the charged batteries. Then I went to bed. The two native men still guarded my sleeping quarters, one replacing the other at midnight. I turned on the current as soon as the first man arrived. I had just fallen asleep when I woke upon hearing the noise of a metal chain. There, at the door, laid the collar from the neck of my father's huge dog. My guard ran to pick it up. He disappeared like a puff of wind, his clothes falling in a pile on the floor. There was a faint trace of gas in the air, but since his body was made up of a mixture of three gases which have no color or smell, there was no other sign of his departure. Yet, when I turned off the current and removed the clothes, I found a deposit of animal carbon and other powders containing the firm elements of his body. I set the trap again and got back into bed. At midnight, I stepped out of bed and removed the remains of the second native guard. I then slept peacefully until morning. I woke up to hear the demanding voice of my father, who was calling to me from across the laboratory. I laughed to myself. There had been no one to call him, and he had slept beyond his usual time. I could hear him crossing the floor with the intention of waking me, so I sat up in bed and waited. I wanted to see every bit of the change to his body, or should I say, I wanted to see him disappear into nothing. He paused for a moment at the door and then took his final step. Puff! It was like the wind blowing through the trees. He was gone. His clothes fell in a strange pile on the floor. I noticed a faint smell, like a burning match. A little pile of hard matter lay among his clothes. That was all. The wide world lay before me. I was free of my father forever.